The trophy sat on the highest shelf in the hallway, where dust collected in a soft halo and the light hit it only at certain angles. It had the right kind of dull gleam trophies get when memories live inside them long enough to wear a kind of patina, not shiny so much as settled. Marcus Hale had arranged it there the first year after Anna died, as if placing a small monument in the domestic landscape would keep things balanced. It looked like pride to guests, a medal of achievement, a brass cup, a little plaque with neat engraving, and Marcus liked that. Pride was a simple thing. It fit his life. Jonah never asked about it. He had been 12 when his mother passed, and his understanding of the trophy had always been the same as the rest of the world's. This was a household trophy, something in the house that meant something, but that no one spoke of. Jonah was good at not speaking, which made the silence between him and his father less noisy than it might have been. He kept to his room, to his homework, to the small rituals a child builds around loss, making his bed a little more carefully, leaving a cup of water by his mother's old nightstand, sometimes glancing at the trophy when the corridor light happened to catch it. The morning it broke began with wet winter light and the smell of coffee. Ordinary things that make homes feel like homes. Jonah had been cleaning. He did it in short bursts, the way people do when they're trying to tidy grief. He had found a box of old-school pamphlets tucked behind the trophy, and in that quiet had thought maybe he could bring something of his mother back to the small world that still accepted him. The school was having a commemorative assembly for past students who'd gone on to do something with their lives, a project for the community, and Jonah, who had been keeping a list of his mother's recipes and small notes of things she'd said, wanted to add a small piece of her to that memory. He thought maybe the trophy could be cleaned, a nameplate polished, maybe even photographed, put with a caption, "For Anna Hale, student, leader, friend." He shouldn't have touched it. He had not been thinking of weight or balance or how long it had spent in its place. He had been thinking of his mother's laugh behind the counter of their tiny bakery, the way she'd press a cinnamon roll in a child's hands and say, "You matter, you little thing." His fingers, young and unpracticed, had slid the cup forward. The bracket slipped. A tiny, soft sound, then a louder one. Glass from the base, the little decorative globe that had once been part of the stand, and then the crash. Jonah's heart raced in his throat as if sound and blood were one. Marcus heard the noise halfway down the stairs. He came into the hallway like a man summoned by a bell. The sight hit him with a small internal jolt. The trophy on its side, the brass cup undented but askew, the base shattered in a scatter of wood and brittle lacquer. Jonah had gone pale white. He stood above the mass like a child before a verdict. He clutched the plaque in both hands as if it were something salvageable. For a slow second, Marcus simply looked. Then he moved. "Jonah," he said. The name was not shouted at first. It had a long pause afterward. "What did you do?" Jonah stammered out something about cleaning, about wanting to put his mother in the school file, about not knowing. His words were quick, jumbled, childish in their earnestness. Marcus felt the room contract. There was a small pressure in his chest, as if someone had closed a fist around air. He had imagined worse things for years, the rest of his house on fire, being alone, but this felt immediate, domestic, intimate in a way that stabbed. The trophy, which he had always sort of thought of as a thing that honored his family, suddenly looked like a relic someone had scooped into a shrine without permission. He saw, stupidly and with a flash of the possessive ire, his late wife's name on the plaque as an accusation rather than a memory. He understood in a raw way that he had invested the object with meanings of his own. It had become part of his armor. His voice rose before his intent did. "What were you thinking?" The words were sharp, brittle against the hallway tiles. Jonah's mouth filled with sound. I wanted to bring her into school, to tell them." He could not make the sentence arrange itself into anything that would be calm. "I was going to fix it. I'm sorry, Dad." Marcus saw the apology like a small, bright animal and tried to cage it with a rebuke. He set his jaw, and the sound when it came was an unpracticed thing that startled them both. You don't touch things that aren't yours to touch. You don't mess with family things. Do you understand? Jonah's shoulders collapsed. Yes. It could have been a small thing. Marcus could have bent down, picked up a fragment and said, "We'll fix it." Or he could have knelt and shown Jonah how to be careful with memory. He did not. He had years of a certain kind of rule stored like currency. Rules that measure time, rules that protect. And those rules were easier. He shouted then, not so much as loud, but as exacting. He told Jonah how clumsy he was, how thoughtless, how inconsiderate of what had been kept in that home like a small island. He spoke of memory and value in a way that made those words sound like counters in a ledger. His voice carried into rooms where neighbors could have heard it if they'd been listening. Jonah did not shout back. He only held the plaque as if it might reassemble itself in his hands. After a while, Marcus left the fragments on the floor and walked away, the sound of his own shoes on wood like a metronome marking an end. He went to the kitchen, poured coffee, and stood by the sink staring out at the gray yard. The day continued, and the sound of the ticking clock seemed louder and smaller and somehow cruel. Jonah cleaned up as best he could. He wrapped the pieces carefully in an old t-shirt and made a small mound on his desk. He pressed his palms against the wood and felt the instant heat of shame. He tried to teach himself not to think about his mother's empty chair at the breakfast table, about the bakery she'd lost and the recipes she had written on napkins, the little flower prints on the counter. He thought of all the ways he had wanted to speak of her and all the ways he had learned silence as a kind of protection. Hours later, Marcus found the box. He hadn't meant to find it. He was looking for a hammer, some simple tool to fasten what must be mended. He opened the linen closet, and beneath a bundle of old scarves, there it was, a battered shoebox with a faded label, the scrapbook of a life he somehow had never pried open. He sat on the floor with it, and the lid came off slow. Inside were photographs, a folded program from a recital, a yellowing newspaper clipping, and a small card on which was printed, Best Soloist, Regional Competition, Anna Hale. He felt something incoherent at first, a small wash of disbelief. The trophy in his hand didn't match his memory. There were photos of Anna, the cup in the background, her hair shorter, her face full of grin and determination. There were letters written to her mother, to herself, pages about practice, curves of script that read like prayers. There was one photograph of Anna standing on a log, a crowd behind her, and in that photo she looked years from being a baker behind a glass case. Marcus read until his hands were tired. He read the sentence where she'd written about the prize and how she'd meant to leave town to study music, but then had met him and chosen a different life. She had tucked the trophy away because it made the house look like an archive, she wrote, and also because there were people who thought music frivolous when bread costs rent. Marcus remembered none of this. He'd always believed the trophy was a sign of something they had together, an emblem he could carry to prove continuity. Page after page stitched pictures into the edges of a life he'd barely measured. He sat there with the box between his knees, as if the things inside could rearrange the days back into the shape he wished he'd noticed sooner. When he returned to the hallway, Jonah was gone. The trophy fragments lay under the kitchen table like an accusation. Marcus felt, peculiarly, almost childishly, a sense of being unmasked. How many other things in that house were not the simple emblems he had made them to be? How many small lives had been smothered under his architecture of order and time? He picked up a shard and turned it over, the lacquer catching the light. For the first time as long as he could remember, guilt had the taste of something real in his mouth. It made him sick and alert and awake. He did not shout. He sat down on the hallway floor and put the box beside him. The clock ticked like a steady surgeon, relentless and indifferent. When Jonah came in that night, Marcus was there, a small square of lamplight warming the box. He did not know how to begin. He had always begun by telling Jonah what was expected.
Now he had to find words he'd never learned to use. Jonah stopped at the doorway, saw the box, and for a second the boy's defiance seemed to dissolve like frost. He sat across from his father, hands fidgeting with the edge of his t-shirt. Marcus held up the newspaper clipping with trembling fingers. "This is hers," he said, the name underlined by time. "This was Anna's." Jonah's face changed. A slow, steady breath left him. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to give her back a voice at school. They asked for stories about people who did great things. I thought—" "You thought you could fix it," Marcus finished, and his voice had a softness that had not been there in the hallway. Jonah nodded, eyes bright. "I thought I could make it right." Marcus sat for a long time. He imagined a different life thread where Anna had taken the soloist tours and where he had supported her, where they had built a family without the cruelties of pride. He imagined telling their son about music nights and the smell of yeast, about how people choose, and how sometimes choice is not only sacrifice, but kindness. He realized with a sharp clarity that felt like frost under skin that he had spent so much time trying to pay careful attention to minutes that he had become blind to the human currency of hours spent together. He reached into the box and drew out a program with his wife's small handwriting on the cover. He passed it to Jonah. "Tell me about her," he said. Jonah's lip trembled. He told him about cinnamon rolls and how she'd hum when she needed, about the way she'd tuck a napkin into his hand when he was small and say, "Be brave today." He told him about the recipe she'd written in his cramped teenage handwriting and how the bakery light had been the prettiest thing he'd ever seen. Marcus listened. For the first time, the hallway did not feel like a place of adjudication. It felt like a space where stories could be placed down and rearranged. When Jonah finished, Marcus spoke. "I was a fool," he said simply. The words were not a confession born of theatrics, but of a long accumulating recognition. "I thought that trophy was mine and our life's proof of being steady. I let that thought become a rule. But it wasn't mine alone, it was hers too. And you were right to want the school to know." Jonah's mouth opened like a small sunrise. "So, you won't be mad?" "I'm already mad at myself," Marcus said. Then he rose, awkward as a man in new terrain. "Help me fix it." They spent the rest of the night gathering fragments, not just of lacquer and wood, but of memory. They found adhesive, cloth, and a box of sandpaper. It was clumsy work. They did not restore the trophy to the polished thing that it once had been. But under the lamp, with the radio humming softly in the background, father and son bent together over wood and brass, making something that would carry both their hands. When they finished, they placed the mended cup on a low shelf in the kitchen, not on the high, unreachable spot Marcus had always preferred, but where Jonah could reach it. The plaque was smoothed and the engraving photographed for the school file. Marcus did not know then that small acts like this would undo a longer habit inside him. He only knew that he had said things that needed saying, and that for the first time in a while, he had listened. Jonah was embarrassed and proud in equal measure, and when the boy smiled, Marcus felt a hollow inside him ease a measure. They went to bed that night with the street light washing the hallway and a faint yellow band. The clock ticked on. It no longer felt like a sentence. Month by month, the mended trophy sat in a new place in the house, lower, accessible, near the small table where morning toast was made. Its surface showed the seams of repair, a line where wood met brass, a thin hair of glue that caught the light like a scar. And that was how Marcus liked it. Scars kept history honest. They marked not perfection, but survival. The school's commemorative assembly came 2 weeks later. Jonah had prepared a short piece about the people who teach you with small, steady acts. Baristas, nurses, the woman at the library, and he had folded the photograph of the repaired trophy into his notebook, the image tucked like a private wink. He felt like the smallest actor in a theater that had outgrown his acceptance of the playing parts. The stage he'd always wanted to be on now felt like a place to offer. Marcus had offered to come, but Jonah declined. "No, I'll do it," he insisted. He wanted the story to rise on its own voice. On the morning of the assembly, the gym smelled like polish and gym socks.
Parents clustered against the bleachers, shuffling programs and whispering. Jonah stood backstage with his palms damp and the folded photograph in his pocket. He drank a sip of water and practiced his breathing the way his mother had taught him once, pressing a thumb into the soft skin between his index finger and thumb until the pulse steadied. He walked out under a single bright stage light. Silence hummed like a held breath. He held up the photograph and began, "This is for Anna Hale. She taught me that work matters the way music matters, that the small things you do every morning make up the song of a life." He spoke of cinnamon rolls and of small, steady kindnesses, of a woman who had once won a prize she'd hidden, and of how sometimes people give up their greatest dreams for the care of others. He did not mention the way his father had shouted that week. Not in those lines. He made space instead for the truth he wanted to place in other ears. "Some things you repair with glue," he said, showing the photo of the trophy, "and some things you repair by remembering." The gym clapped politely at first, then, as the story threaded into the collected hearts, the clapping grew softer and real. Marcus sat silently in the crowd, hands ramrod straight on his knees, watching his son speak about a life he had hardly seen until now. When Jonah mentioned Anna's name, a small hand blossomed in Marcus's chest. Not the ownership he'd thought he'd had, but the tender place that had kept his love for her like a secret ember. After the assembly, a teacher approached Marcus cautiously. "Your son's piece, it was moving," she said, voice careful. "There's a community exhibit coming up at the library. They want to include a display on local lives. Jonah's piece, Anna's story, could be part of it. Would you mind if it was?" Marcus looked at his son, who was stepping back into the hall with a small, proud smile. He swallowed and nodded. "Yes," he said. "Yes, he can." The voice surprised him with its softness. Over the next month, the community took on the project as if it had always been waiting for them to remember. A neighbor offered to photograph Anna's old recipe cards. A retired teacher scanned the clipping. The librarian, Mrs. Green, made space on a long table for a display. A photograph of Anna in her recital dress, the repaired trophy, a small stack of recipe cards bound with twine. Marcus found himself going to the bakery of an old friend and asking about flour sacks and pastry tins with a new curiosity. Life slowly rearranged. He began setting his alarm a little later, not from a change in habit, but from a change in desire. He joined Jonah on a Saturday to tape the photograph to a backing board, his fingers working the way an old man's do, careful and patient. The boy watched him, and sometimes the two of them said not much, which was enough. On opening night at the library, the room was crowded in a way that felt generous rather than crowded. People came with coats and scarves and small smiles. They read the display notes and placed sticky notes on the board with little memories of someone they'd once met. A woman came up to Marcus and offered a small apology for never asking how Anna had chosen the bakery. She spoke of the music program and of the way Anna had practiced scales under a street lamp because the bakery smelled of yeast and clattered plates. Marcus listened and realized how much of his life had been spent inside a frame he'd painted himself. He had stood too often in the doorway and watched life as if it were a stage on which he had no lines. Now the stage was his son's voice and his late wife's memory. He stood in the library that evening and felt, with a slow certainty, that being present meant a different kind of discipline, one that measured presence rather than minutes. People began to ask him, sometimes quietly, for stories. He told them one about a woman who had once walked in a contest and won a ribbon for a solo that made the judge cry. He told them about how she had chosen family sometimes over tours, how her hands both kneaded dough and stroked a piano. Jonah stood at his side and added small annotations, the exact way she rolled cinnamon and the sound of her low laugh. It was awkward at first for Marcus to talk about tenderness. He learned the names of being gentle out loud. A week after the exhibit opened, Marcus received a letter. It was typed and small and came from the Regional Music Society. They wanted to posthumously honor Anna's contribution to the community, they wrote, because music was a thread she had left in quiet corners. Marcus read the letter at the kitchen table, the repaired trophy nearby like a lighthouse in the dim room. He felt his throat tighten and then loosen, as if something had finally been set right.
He called Jonah then, not with instructions or admonitions, but simply to tell him the news. Jonah whooped over the phone, a boy at the rim of becoming a man, and Marcus, who had once measured his voice in rules, found the right sound to say,
You did well. Time did not suddenly become a soft thing. Marcus still rose early, sometimes out of habit. He still set his watch and checked the mailbox. But the rules he kept no longer felt like stones to build walls with. They had become a structure that could hold small softnesses. A Saturday morning spent in a bookstore together, a new habit of making coffee and bringing a cup to Jonah when the boy was studying, the practice of leaving the light on in the kitchen until both of them were asleep. Years later, Jonah returned from college, older and gentler. He brought with him a small manila envelope, a program from a recital where he had performed one of Anna's pieces on the piano as a tribute. Marcus, who had once measured his voice in rules, found the right sound to say, "You did well." Time did not suddenly become a soft thing. Marcus still rose early, sometimes out of habit. He still set his watch and checked the mailbox. But the rules he kept no longer felt like stones to build walls with. They had become a structure that could hold small softnesses. A Saturday morning spent in a bookstore together. A new habit of making coffee and bringing a cup to Jonah when the boy was studying. The practice of leaving the light on in the kitchen until both of them were asleep. Years later, Jonah returned from college, older and gentler. He brought with him a small manila envelope, a program from a recital where he had performed one of Anna's pieces on the piano as a tribute. Marcus, who had once measured his voice in rules, found the right sound to say, "You did well." Time did not suddenly become a soft thing. Marcus still rose early, sometimes out of habit. He still set his watch and checked the mailbox. But the rules he kept no longer felt like stones to build walls with. They had become a structure that could hold small softnesses. A Saturday morning spent in a bookstore together. A new habit of making coffee and bringing a cup to Jonah when the boy was studying. The practice of leaving the light on in the kitchen until both of them were asleep. When Marcus died, years later, quietly in his sleep, a natural end that felt merciful. The pocket of his jacket did not hold a ledger or a list of rules. It held 3 small things: a newspaper clipping about Anna's honor, the receipt for the glue used to repair the trophy, and a scrap of a note Jonah had once written and folded into a shirt pocket. "Dad, we fixed it together." At the funeral, people spoke of Marcus as a man of discipline. They said he had loved according to the shape he had been given. But Jonah, who had both the trophies of the living and the mended relics of the dead, spoke in this series of small truths that are truer than platitudes. "My father taught me how to be steady. And he taught me, in the end, that steadiness is most useful when it holds people, not time." Outside, the repaired trophy was placed in a small case at the community center, with a little brass tag, "For Anna Hale, honored by neighbors." Children ran past, the noise bright and immediate. Jonah watched them and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with clocks. He felt time finally as a place in which love is measured, not in minutes, but in the ways people gather and stay. He took the pocket watch from his father's belongings and wound it gently, the way Anna might have wound a metronome. He placed it now not in a drawer for safekeeping, but on a bedside table for a small boy he loved, who would one day ask why the old clock had stopped and why a trophy had come to matter. He told that boy the same story he one time told his father, that some trophies are for the applause and some are for the quiet work that lasts long after anyone claps. He had learned, and taught, a final thing. Rules are small ships. Kindness is the port. The worth of any day is how many times you chose to stay.
From the moment I met you, everything changed. A simple smile and the world rearranged.